Commander Darian Voss leaned over the console, the words on the screen still echoing in his mind as they settled into a cold, immutable reality. His eyes skimmed the official decree again. The Galactic Council had spoken. The verdict was final. The transmission was crystal clear. Humanity's military forces were prohibited from engaging in any galactic conflict, their ships restricted to the confines of the Sol system. The vote had been unanimous, the decision irrevocable. Darian clenched his fists as he read the lines one last time. He had seen the warning signs. He had witnessed it during the Krell War, the moment when humanity had crossed a threshold that no other species dared to approach. Humanity fought wars differently. They saw it not as an extension of politics, but as a problem to be solved. Every calculation had been based on survival. Lives lost were simply sacrifices to ensure the greater good, a harsh reality others couldn't grasp. He looked across the room at his fellow officers. Their faces were unreadable, but he could feel the weight of the collective disappointment. Admiral Laura Bennett stood at the head of the room, her stance firm, but betraying a trace of weariness. Her voice echoed through the space as she addressed the officers present, a slight edge of bitterness cutting through the otherwise steady tone. "We came when they called," she said, a sharpness in her words. "We lost ships, we lost men, and this is how they repay us. They'll say it's for the greater good, but they'll never understand." She turned her gaze toward the window where the distant stars blinked silently, a reminder of the vast gulf between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. The room fell silent as the full gravity of the decree settled in. The human delegation had been at the forefront of defending the galaxy against the Krell, a race whose savagery matched the worst horrors the galaxy had ever known. But the tactics humanity employed, sacrificing entire sectors of space to destroy enemy fleets, were too extreme for the other species in the Council. "Your forces," came the voice of Ambassador Koloth from the DL Ken, his four hands folded respectfully, but his tone revealed an undercurrent of fear. "In the Battle of Proxima Centauri, you vented reactor plasma. You created a trap to destroy the Krell ships. But the civilian colonies in the system were not evacuated in time. You sacrificed those lives without hesitation." His eyes narrowed as he gazed at the humans. "You see the enemy as a problem to be solved, but at what cost?" Darian's mind drifted back to that fateful decision, to the sacrifice of thousands to save billions. It had been Captain Frank Martinez's call. He had made the decision to abandon the outer mining colonies of Proxima Centauri, knowing that the human fleet could not win otherwise. The math was simple, but the implications, human lives lost for a greater cause, were staggering. His actions had saved Earth, but at the cost of alien alliances and any claim to moral superiority. "That's the point, Koloth," Laura Bennett countered, her voice unwavering despite the sting of the accusation. "We did what needed to be done to stop the Krell, but the Council wanted us to fight with honor, with rules that don't apply when you're facing an enemy that doesn't care about your treaties or your moral guidelines. The Krell didn't play by anyone's rules." Why should we? The silence that followed was thick with tension. The debate had already been decided. The Council couldn't accept the cost of humanity's victory, not when it involved sacrificing so many. Not when their methods were so foreign, so uncomfortable. They had done what was necessary, but the Council was unwilling to recognize that necessity. "Humanity doesn't fight like we do," said Ambassador Zilthar, his voice calm but firm. "You don't see war as a political tool, a last resort, as we do. You see it as survival. You decide to win no matter the cost. That's not something we can accept." His words hung in the air, accusations veiled in diplomatic decorum. The memories of the battle flooded back, the unrelenting chaos of humanity's tactics. Earth had thrown everything it had into the fight. They had converted civilian ships into makeshift carriers, transformed mining rigs into weapons, and turned every piece of infrastructure they could find into a fortress. The Council had expected humanity to contribute resources, a few ships, some minor assistance. Instead, they had unleashed a wave of unconventional warfare. The Council had underestimated humanity. And when the Krell Dominion had launched its campaign to take Council space, Earth had struck back with everything it had, outsmarting the enemy with guerrilla tactics that left no room for mercy. But the result was more than the Council could bear. Humanity had won, but the cost had shattered the Council's notion of proper conduct. Darian's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp, unmistakable voice of Grand Counselor Valine. "The ban is effective immediately," she announced, her voice resolute, as the council chambers fell silent once again. "All human military vessels are to return to Sol system within 30 days. Non-compliance will result in further sanctions." The words echoed in Darian's ears as the implications sank in. He had led humans into the fight, and now he was being forced to retreat, forced to stand down. The weight of the decision, of the ban, settled heavily on him, a burden he hadn't expected to bear. His hands clenched around the console in front of him, his mind racing with the reality of what had just happened. Humanity was now excluded from the galaxy's wars. Their place among the stars had been marked as a liability. For the next few days, the Earth fleet made its way back home. The ships, battered and broken, limped through the galaxy. They were met with few words of gratitude. The humans had done what was necessary, but they had broken every rule in the process. They had fought with a resolve no one else could understand, but it had cost them everything. As they neared Earth's orbit, Darian stood at the bridge of the Intrepid, looking out at the stars. Lieutenant Samantha Powell slid into the seat next to him, her face grim as she pushed a tablet toward him. "Look at this," she said, her voice tinged with anger. "They're calling us savages. Humans too dangerous to fight alongside the Council." Darian pushed the tablet away, his eyes narrowing. "We won their war for them. That's the problem." Captain Olivia Wells stepped into the room, her face weary but resolute. "We showed them something they didn't want to see," she said quietly. "What's that?" Darian asked, turning to her. "That their rules of war don't work against an enemy that doesn't play by the rules," she replied. "The Krell would have wiped them out if they kept fighting with their neat battle formations and their careful responses. Humanity doesn't have that luxury." The realization hit Darian hard. The Council had banned them not because of their inability to fight, but because they fought without hesitation. They had sacrificed everything to save the galaxy, and in the end, it was their brutality that the galaxy could not accept. But in the same breath, it was that very same brutality that would eventually be needed again. And when that day came, humanity would be ready to fight. As Earth's fleet sailed back to its home system, Darian couldn't shake the bitter taste of rejection. The galaxy might forget about humanity's methods, but humanity would never forget the galaxy's hesitation when the real war had begun. Darian Voss sat in the dimly lit briefing room, the glow from the heads-up displays casting sharp shadows on his face. He'd spent the last 20 years of his life avoiding war, focusing instead on developing Earth's defense infrastructure and living with the ghosts of those brutal years spent fighting the Krell. But now, with every pulse of light across the display, the ghosts felt closer. The news had been inescapable. The Void Swarm, a force of annihilation that didn't care about treaties or codes of war, was making its way deeper into Council space, leaving entire planets barren in its wake. Entire colonies, civilian centers, had been reduced to smoldering ruins. The only evidence of their existence, the distant memories of the families who once called them home. Darian's eyes darted to the glowing symbols that scrolled across the laser plasma displays. The Void Swarm didn't follow any order, but its own. Their ships were a strange combination of organic and mechanical, twisting and changing as if driven by a collective hive mind, making them nearly impossible to predict. Traditional military tactics were ineffective. The swarm adapted too quickly, every strategy undone in an instant. And now the Council was asking for humanity's help. The door to the briefing room slid open, and Captain Olivia Donovan stepped in. Darian stiffened slightly, but it wasn't out of surprise. He had known she'd be here. This was her mission as much as it was his. They had served together in the final days of the Krell War, and it had been Olivia who had guided him through his darkest moments. Now she was about to lead him back into the fight. "We've been called back," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying an edge of resignation. "You're telling me," Darian muttered, standing from his chair and walking toward the display. The data was as cold and clinical as it was horrifying. The swarm's attacks had overwhelmed the Council's fleets with alarming speed. Civilian evacuations were already being reported as failing. The last count showed that over half a dozen planets had fallen to the swarm's relentless expansion. No one was prepared for the threat, not even the Council, despite their military superiority. They're sending a covert envoy, Olivia continued, not for ships, not for soldiers, just a few humans with combat experience. Observers. Darian turned to face her. Observers, he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. After everything we've done, everything we've sacrificed, they want us to sit on the sidelines? Olivia's eyes softened. They're scared. They think they can handle this, but they know they can't. The Council's tactics aren't working. They need us. Not as soldiers, but as strategists, as consultants. He scoffed. Consultants? The Council doesn't ask for help. They demand it. But this is an insult. I'm not saying it's right, Olivia said, stepping closer. But the reality is, Earth's methods worked against the Krell. And right now, the Council is desperate. They can't stop the swarm with their usual playbook. Darian clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want to return to the mess of war, to the unbearable weight of decisions that cost lives. He'd chosen peace, and that was where he wanted to stay. But how could he ignore the threat? How could he turn his back when millions of innocent lives were at stake? I'm not going to beg you, Darian, Olivia said, her tone hardening, but you know as well as I do that we're the only ones who can fight this. We know how to survive when it seems impossible. Darian stared at the display again, seeing the faces of the men and women he had once led, now retired, their names buried beneath the veil of history. There were no easy answers. He could feel the pull, the weight of duty gnawing at him. The Council would never accept humanity's methods, never accept that Earth fought for survival, not for honor or glory. But this wasn't about glory. It was about saving lives. He let out a long breath. When do we leave? Olivia's gaze softened, but there was no joy in it. Only the weariness of someone who had seen too much. Tomorrow, we'll brief the team and then head for Council space. The decision had been made. Darian didn't like it, but there was no going back. As much as he tried to rationalize it, there was no escaping the harsh truth. Humanity's return to war was inevitable. But how could he reconcile the cost of survival with the moral compromises they would have to make? The next day, Darian stood at the helm of the Intrepid once more, flanked by the few soldiers who had been called back to duty. It felt strange, unnatural to be preparing for battle again after so many years of peace. His mind kept drifting back to the day he had left the military behind, to the moment he had sworn never to fight again. But that was before the swarm, before this new threat. The galaxy had changed, and so had he. The flight to Council space felt longer than it was. Each passing moment was a reminder that they weren't going back to fight for victory. They were going to fight for survival. They were going to have to embrace the same brutal tactics that had gotten them banned in the first place. As the ship entered Council space, Darian couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The swarm had been right to attack. They had found weakness in the galaxy's approach. The Council's neat battle formations, their adherence to rules and protocols, had only made them more vulnerable. The swarm was a reflection of what humanity had already become. Chaotic, unpredictable, a force of destruction that could not be reasoned with. When they arrived, the Council had prepared a welcome for them. Not a grand reception, but a cold, calculated request for aid. They had no choice but to ask, no other option left. The galaxy's fate was in the balance, and they needed humanity's savagery, whether they liked it or not. Darian stood before the Council's representatives, his mind spinning with conflicting thoughts. The past seemed like a distant memory now, but the faces of those who had fallen still haunted him. How many more would die in this war? And for what? This is it, Darian, Olivia whispered from behind him. We can't change how we fight. We're here to survive. We always have been. The Council's plea was simple. Help them turn the tide. They didn't want humanity to engage in open warfare. They just needed a strategy, a plan. But Darian knew it wasn't that simple. The swarm had already shown its hand, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to fight like they had before. Without rules, without mercy. And as much as Darian hated the thought, He knew deep down that humanity was the only one left who could save the galaxy. The rest were too bound by their rules to act when the moment called for it. They would never understand why humanity fought the way it did. For the first time in a long time, Darien felt the cold, familiar weight of war settle on his shoulders. There would be no easy way out. There would be no escape from the cost of survival. But if they were going to do this, if humanity was going to fight again, they would fight on their terms. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Darien Voss stood at the command center, watching the flickering heads-up displays, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the control console. His pulse was steady, but his mind raced with the reality of the situation. The Void Swarm had engaged full force. Their ships, a blend of unnatural biology and technology, swarming toward them like a storm of relentless hunger. "Move your ships now!" Olivia Donovan's voice rang out, sharp and commanding over the comms as she barked orders to their fleet. The ships had barely taken position when the first Void Swarm ship breached the perimeter, its massive, segmented form tearing through the quiet vacuum, firing erratic pulses of energy. Darien's thoughts were interrupted by the flash of movement on the display. Civilian vessels, slow-moving transports, and even cargo ships were making a break for it, diverting from their original course. They were the bait. "Is this really what we're doing?" Darien's voice was barely audible as he watched Earth's fleet arrange itself in unpredictable formations, weaving between the attacking swarm ships. He knew what would happen next. He had seen it too many times before. Sacrifices were always necessary. "We don't have a choice, Darien." Olivia's voice came through calm yet tight with the burden of leadership. "The Council is too slow. If we don't act fast, we lose everything." As the first volley of fire from the Void Swarm exploded across the screen, Darien felt his gut tighten. Ships of all sizes in Earth's fleet split off, veering wildly as they closed in on the swarm. They weren't following any standard tactical formations, any predictable patterns that the swarm could anticipate. Instead, they created a chaotic mosaic of ship movements, each Earth vessel moving like an individual player in a violent, unpredictable game. The first decoy, an old cargo freighter, entered the fray. It was a move that would have been unthinkable in any normal battle. But it was just another day in humanity's twisted brand of warfare. The freighter's engines flared in a desperate burst, dragging a trio of swarm ships directly into an ambush. An explosive volley ripped apart one of the swarm vessels, sending fragments into the void. But the tactic had its cost. The cargo ship's hull was torn apart, debris scattering in all directions. A few thousand lives lost in an instant. Darien's eyes moved over to the damage reports that flashed across his screen. He didn't want to admit it, but the tactic had worked, at least for now. The swarm was confused, thrown off by the sudden, disjointed nature of the fight. But it wasn't over. Not yet. "Next decoy," Olivia ordered, her gaze fixed on the monitors. "Let's see how they respond to this." Another civilian ship, a medical vessel, pushed its way into the chaos. The desperate moves felt like a calculated gamble. The swarm adapted fast, but Earth's forces were forcing them to adapt even faster. And with every move, the risk grew. More ships were moving in, some firing indiscriminately, some drawing attention away from the main targets. The tactics felt wrong, but they were the only tactics that had ever worked. "You're not seriously going to let them continue with this?" A voice came from behind Darien. He turned to see Commander Kyle Zinn, one of the Council's senior officers, his face pale from the tension. His gaze flickered between the chaotic battlefield and Darien, who could see the conflict in the man's eyes. Kyle had seen the same footage the others had, the decoys, the sacrifices, but the question of whether this was the right move still lingered in the air like a poisonous fog. "They'll get used to it," Darien muttered, his hand gripping the edge of the console, "or they'll die trying." The battlefield shifted again. Earth's forces had drawn a significant portion of the swarm into a trap. A series of tactical misdirections, false retreats, feigned explosions, and decoy signals forced the swarm into an isolated cluster of ships, perfectly positioned for a counterstrike. "Activate the decoy fleet," Darien said to Olivia, who gave him a curt nod. They were using the old battered ships now, the ones that couldn't survive any serious engagement. But their purpose was clear: Draw the swarm into an unprotected flank, then unleash everything. Earth's warships, spread thin over the field, now began closing in. This time, the swarm had no chance to escape. The explosion was deafening, even through the soundless void of space. The decoy fleet lit up the dark sky with the violent flash of igniting engines and warheads. For a moment, Darien could see nothing but the cascading plumes of debris. The swarm had fallen for it, again. They had overcommitted, abandoning their usual formations for the lure of the decoys. "Ready the strike force," Olivia's voice came through, steely calm. It was time. Darien watched as Earth's warships moved in for the final strike, breaking the swarm's formations with calculated chaos. The swarm ships, despite their adaptability, were confused. The Earth vessels didn't move as one. They moved as separate, wild entities. Each ship was a weapon in itself, drawing fire, creating opportunities for others. And it worked. The swarm's once-ordered fleet now buckled under the weight of Earth's madness, a relentless assault of unpredictability. Darien watched as the swarm flagship, the largest ship, was exposed, its defensive shields weakening under the barrage. One of Earth's dreadnoughts, the Defiance, surged forward, taking damage as it broke through the shields, creating a perfect opening for other ships to fire at the control vessel's core. The battle raged on for hours. The tide had turned in their favor, but at a heavy cost. Earth had won, but the victory felt like a bitter aftertaste, the price of survival too steep to swallow comfortably. As the last swarm ships drifted into destruction, the remnants of Earth's fleet pulled back to assess the damage. "We did it," Olivia said, a quiet note of relief in her voice. But Darien could sense the unease in her tone. They had won the battle, but at what cost? Darien stared out the viewport as the smoke of battle began to clear. "We did," he said, his voice distant. "But at what cost?" The message from the council came quickly, but it wasn't one of celebration. The council was horrified by the method of victory. The representatives who had watched the battle unfold now viewed Earth's tactics as barbaric. The strategy had been effective, but it had broken every rule the council held sacred. "We've won, but they won't understand us," Olivia said as she walked to his side, her face shadowed with the weight of the victory. "No," Darien agreed. "They never will." Darien's mind raced as the council's praise, mixed with their disgust, began to filter through. They had won the battle, yes, but the real fight was still ahead of them. The council may never accept humanity's methods, and that was something Darien knew they would never be able to change. The personal cost of their methods began to weigh heavily on him. He had made those decisions, those choices that saved the galaxy, but the guilt of the sacrifice hung over him. Could they keep fighting this way? And at what price? "I'll never forget the cost," Darien whispered. Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice resolute. "We don't have the luxury to stop. This war isn't over." Darien nodded, the bitter realization settling in. The real question wasn't whether they would fight again. It was whether humanity could live with the price of survival. The quiet buzz of the laser plasma displays seemed to hum louder as the doors to the Galactic Council chamber slid open. Darien Voss stood tall at the back of the room, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. The council had convened again, and this time, it was not just about the Void Swarm. The aftermath of humanity's involvement in the battle had shaken the very foundation of the galactic order. The council members, seated in their elevated positions, stared down at the representatives from Earth, their expressions a mixture of distrust and reluctant acknowledgement. "Humanity has once again proven their effectiveness in warfare," Ambassador Vareth of the Drelken began, his voice echoing through the chamber. His words were measured, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Their methods, however, continue to challenge everything we stand for." Darien could feel the eyes of the room on him, a few sympathetic, most critical. The battle with the Void Swarm had cost many lives on both sides, but Earth's tactics had turned the tide. The sacrifice fleet, as it had been called, was still fresh in everyone's minds. Civilian ships used as decoys, military fleets acting outside of conventional command structures, and the unflinching willingness to lose ships, human lives in the pursuit of victory. The argument had begun before Darien entered the room, as it had so many times in the last few days. Some factions within the Council argued for a more permanent alliance with Earth, pointing out that humanity's methods, while extreme, were undeniably effective against the Void Swarm. Others, particularly the Ashari delegation, voiced their disgust. Ambassador Zilthar, who had been one of the leading voices against humanity's involvement 50 years ago, was now vehemently opposing any further military collaboration. "They will continue to break our codes, Ambassador," Zilthar hissed, his slender blue form rising. "We cannot allow such actions to become standard procedure. What they did was barbaric." "They saved countless lives," Vareth shot back, his words carrying more weight than he perhaps intended. "What the Krell could not destroy, the Swarm could not overwhelm, thanks to the human intervention." "But at what cost?" Zilthar retorted, his voice quivering with suppressed emotion. "A civilization that does not respect life, that sacrifices innocence without a second thought, cannot be allowed to roam free among us?" Darian clenched his fists, the words cutting through him like a physical wound. He had heard this before. The judgment, the accusation. The Council saw Earth as a dangerous, unpredictable force. Humanity had always fought to win, regardless of the rules, and that fact had caused irreparable damage to their standing among the galactic races. A quiet voice from the side of the chamber called out, "Perhaps we need to reevaluate what we stand for." It was Councillor Darren of the Valaran species, a typically neutral party in these matters. His voice was calm, but there was something forceful beneath the surface. "The Void Swarm respects no order, no treaty, and no line. In their war, there are no rules, only survival. What makes us think that our protocols will be enough to fight them?" Darian's eyes flickered over to the other side of the room, where the delegates from the Sworn Alliance, a faction that had witnessed the destruction of entire systems by the Void Swarm, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were beginning to understand. Humanity's chaotic approach, while alien and brutal, was also the only thing that had managed to turn the tide. "You propose we condone this madness?" Zilthar demanded, his voice rising. "That we grant them further liberty to destroy our values for the sake of victory?" Commander Darian Voss exhaled slowly, his gaze moving from one council member to the next. He had fought these battles before, long ago, and here he was again, forced to defend the very thing that had led to humanity's downfall. But this time, it was different. The stakes had never been so high. "It's not about condoning their methods," Darian said, his voice cutting through the rising murmurs in the room. "It's about understanding that the enemy we face respects no boundaries. And if we're going to survive, we can't afford to cling to a code that has already failed us." He felt Olivia's gaze on him. She stood beside him in the chamber, silent but resolute. She had never asked for this, never wanted to return to this life. But here they were, forced to lead again. She had been Darian's mentor, his guiding force when he was just a young officer. Now she was a symbol of humanity's resolve, and, to the Council, a symbol of the very defiance they sought to eradicate. "We're not asking you to abandon your codes," Olivia spoke up now, her voice steady and controlled. "We're asking you to see that sometimes survival demands we bend the rules. If the Swarm wins, all your precious codes will be meaningless." The Council fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, others steeled their resolve. The debate raged on for hours, each side pulling at the fabric of the galaxy's future, a future that was rapidly becoming more uncertain with each passing minute. As the council meeting broke for recess, Darian walked slowly down the corridor, the weight of the debate pressing down on him. The day had been a failure in many ways. Humanity was no closer to being accepted into the galactic fold, and the council's skepticism was as strong as ever. The Void Swarm had not been defeated yet, and with every hour that passed, it pressed further into council space. Their conventional tactics had proven ineffective. Humanity's methods, though hated, were the only chance left. "Do you think they'll ever accept us?" Olivia asked, her voice quiet but intense as she fell in step beside him. "No," Darren replied, his voice low. "But they'll need us. They'll realize they have no choice." They walked in silence, knowing that the debate was far from over. The rift between humanity and the Galactic Council had deepened, and the void left by their unwillingness to accept humanity's methods would only grow. The council was divided, torn between the ancient traditions that had long sustained galactic order and the brutal, unrelenting force that humanity represented. As the doors to the council chambers closed behind them, Darian and Olivia knew that no matter how this debate ended, Earth's place in the galaxy would never be the same. The swarm had come with an intensity that even the seasoned commanders of the Galactic Council hadn't anticipated. The alarms across the fleet sounded, sharp and insistent, as the void swarm's overwhelming numbers cut through the Council's defensive lines with ruthless precision. Ships disintegrated into clouds of debris, their remains swallowed by the relentless tide of the enemy's advance. The traditional strategies that had worked against every other adversary now seemed obsolete against a force that disregarded all rules of engagement, a force that adapted too quickly, too ferociously. "Commander, we're losing the edge," Lieutenant Maris said, his voice strained as he stood next to Darian Voss on the bridge of the Earth defense vessel Valor. His eyes were fixed on the tactical display, the swirling mass of void swarm ships expanding at an alarming rate. "They're not stopping. Our formations, our systems, everything is falling apart." Darian didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the same display, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting to the same thought that had haunted him since the moment the Council had reluctantly called Earth back into service. Had they made the right choice? The galaxy's fate now rested in their hands, but the cost was mounting, and Darian could already hear the weight of the lives lost in the silence between the flashes of distant explosions. He had always led with one goal: survival. But now that survival was slipping through his fingers, the question was no longer just about victory. It was about the cost, the lives he'd sacrificed, the decisions he'd made that went against everything the Council stood for, were beginning to settle like stones in his stomach. "Commanders, the Council's forces are breaking," came a voice from the comms officer. "We can't hold them off any longer. They're flooding our sector. We need the Earth fleet now." Darian's heart sank. The Council's fleet, a proud force composed of the galaxy's most advanced technologies, was crumbling under the Void Swarm's relentless assault, and Earth's military, despite the ban, was all that was left to prevent total annihilation. At that moment, Darian knew the time had come. The Valor shook as another wave of swarm fighters closed in, the force of their barrage causing the ship's outer hull to groan in protest. The damage was building. The tactical retreat had already failed. All that was left was the fight, and Earth's method was the only option left. "Prepare to engage," Darian ordered, his voice cold, no hesitation in his tone. The decision had been made. "We fight differently. Keep them guessing. No patterns." The crew braced themselves, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Darian turned to the officer at the weapons console. "We're going to take this fight to them. No order, no coordination, just chaos. Give them something they won't predict." As the fleet readied for the battle, Olivia Donovan, his former mentor, joined him at the bridge. Her expression was resolute, but Darian saw the hesitation in her eyes, the same doubt that had plagued them both ever since the Council had sent that fateful message. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of her years in the field clearly visible. "This isn't like before," she said quietly. "We can't just send everything to the front lines without thinking it through. We have to—" "We don't have the luxury of thinking it through," Darian cut her off, his voice tight. "The Council's methods have already failed. Now it's time for us to do what we do best." The Valor leapt into the fray, its sleek form cutting through the chaos, the unpredictable chaos. The human method was all about survival, and sometimes that meant breaking every rule that had been written. The ships under Darian's command darted through the swarm, weaving and dodging in seemingly random patterns, drawing the swarm's fire to themselves while other ships attacked from unexpected angles. It was madness. It was chaos. It was Earth's way. On the battlefield, the Earth fleet operated like a broken mirror, shards scattering in every direction. One ship would feign retreat, only to swing back at the right moment, taking out 3 swarm vessels before anyone could react. Another vessel took fire from 5 different directions, only to return with a surprise flank, its unexpected attack leaving the swarm in disarray. It wasn't coordinated in the traditional sense. It was just unpredictable. "We're losing ships," came the call from Olivia, her voice edged with concern. "Our losses are mounting faster than we can manage them." Darian clenched his teeth. "We fight to survive, not to win a perfect battle," he muttered under his breath. As the battle raged on, the Void Swarm's relentless advance faltered, if only for a moment. Their formations became erratic, reacting to the unpredictability of Earth's tactics. Each strike from the Earth fleet shattered the swarm's cohesion, and slowly it began to show. Their superiority was waning. Yet for every victory, another ship fell from the Earth fleet. The internal conflict within Darian grew with each new explosion. Was this really worth it? The lives lost? The damage to the very principles that humanity had been banned for? He looked out across the battlefield, watching as another Earth vessel was torn apart, its crew sacrificed in the name of survival. And yet, despite the mounting death toll, the swarm's control was slipping. The unpredictability of humanity's tactics was turning the tide. "Status?" Darian asked, his voice steady despite the gnawing doubt in his chest. "We're gaining ground, sir," came the response, but there was no triumph in it. "But we can't last much longer. We're taking too much damage." Darian's eyes narrowed as he watched a massive void swarm vessel begin to break off from the main formation, targeting the weak points of the Council's remaining ships. The time had come. "Olivia, we need to act fast," Darian said, turning to his old friend. "I can't ask my people to keep sacrificing like this." Olivia met his gaze with the same resolve that had guided them through countless battles. "We don't have a choice," she said simply. The Valor surged forward, its systems screaming under the strain. In the chaos of the battle, Darian knew one thing with certainty. He was willing to sacrifice whatever it took. The lives of his crew, the mission, even his own morality. It was all on the line. "Engage the swarm's control ship," Darian barked into the comms. "We go for the heart, leave nothing standing." As the final push began, Darian felt the weight of the universe press down on him. Humanity was always seen as a force to be feared, but now in this final hour, they were something else. They were the last hope. And as Earth's fleet broke through the swarm's defenses, one last desperate stand, the full cost of their actions would be realized. There was no going back now. They had done what no one else could, defeat the undefeatable. And at what cost? Darian had no answer. The silence that followed the battle felt heavier than any explosion. The once glorious fleet of the Galactic Council, now scattered and broken, limped back to their home systems. Humanity's brutal methods had secured victory, but it came at a high price. Darian Voss stood on the observation deck of the Valor, watching the distant stars as the damage reports came in. The battle was over, but the cost was indelible. His mind wandered, the weight of the dead heavy on his chest. He had led them all into this, but it had never been about honor or victory. It had been about survival. The cost of survival, however, was a burden that could never be erased. As Earth's ships returned to their formation, a ghostly silence fell over the bridge. Even the crew, so accustomed to chaos, couldn't hide the grief that hung in the air. Darian's comm beeped, pulling him from his thoughts. Olivia Donovan's voice came through, steady as ever. "Darian, the Council wants to speak with you. They've finally acknowledged the victory." It was strange to hear those words. The victory was undeniable. The Void Swarm had been repelled, their momentum shattered by Earth's unpredictable chaos. But how could victory feel like this? He didn't know if it was relief, guilt, or something else entirely. "Tell them I'll be there," Darian replied, his voice distant, "and tell them to make it quick." Minutes later, he stood before the Council's representatives, a strange sense of finality in the air. The atmosphere was thick with a kind of reluctant respect, as if they were still struggling to reconcile the means with the outcome. There was no applause, no celebration, only the soft hum of conversation that died down as Darian entered. "Commander Voss," said Grand Counselor Valine, his voice heavy with authority, "we have come to a consensus. Though your methods were unorthodox, we cannot ignore the result." Darian nodded, his mind racing. He had expected praise, but it was harder to hear than he anticipated. "The Void Swarm is gone. Your fleets are still intact. What else is there to say?" Ambassador Vareth, standing to the side, spoke next, his voice measured but heavy with the weight of history. It is true that Earth's actions have saved the Council. You have accomplished what many believed impossible. However, your methods— He paused, searching for the right words. They are a double-edged sword. They saved us, but they may cost us more in the future. Darian's jaw tightened. He had heard this before. The Council, for all their power, still couldn't understand why Earth fought the way it did. They couldn't see the necessity in the sacrifice. They saw it as barbarism, while he saw it as survival. We will propose a solution, Vareth continued. We cannot allow Earth to engage in our wars on a regular basis, but we acknowledge that when an existential threat arises, your methods may be required once again. Darian's brow furrowed. A solution? You're still not willing to fully embrace what we can do for you. It is not that simple, Vareth replied, the weight of the years in his eyes. The Council's integrity cannot be compromised. We need a solution that allows Earth to act when necessary, but with more oversight. Olivia stepped forward, her gaze sharp. And what does that mean for humanity? She asked. You want us to save you again, but under our terms? Vareth looked at her, his expression unreadable. Yes, that is the compromise we propose. Earth will be allowed to engage in warfare only when an existential threat to civilian populations arises. No more. The ban on your military involvement will remain, but with this amendment— Darian felt the air leave his lungs. An amendment, a carefully worded decision that gave humanity a foothold in galactic matters, but also kept them at arm's length. His people had saved the galaxy, and yet they were being told to remain on the sidelines unless they were needed again. That's your solution? Darian's voice was hard. A leash that you can pull when it suits you? A temporary truce until your next moral dilemma? Olivia glanced at him but didn't speak. Darian had always been the one to take the hard choices. She was more reserved, more philosophical, but even she had her doubts. We will vote on this proposal, Valine said, as if this decision was the only path forward. And when the vote passes, Earth's place in the galaxy will be formalized. You will not be our equals, but neither will you be outsiders. The room fell silent as the council deliberated. Darian looked around, the faces of the representatives a mixture of resignation, fear, and the faintest traces of admiration. They knew they had no other option, but the cost of humanity's victory, of their methods, was heavy on all their minds. Minutes later, the vote passed, with a narrow majority. The compromise was accepted. Earth's fleet would remain under the ban, but in times of dire need, humanity would be called upon to fight. Darian stepped out of the chamber, his mind a whirl of thoughts. What did this mean for Earth's future? They had fought and sacrificed, and now they were being given the barest of allowances to remain active in galactic affairs. There was no glory in this victory, no honor, only the grim satisfaction of survival. Olivia walked beside him in silence as they made their way back to the Valor. The weight of the decision settled between them. I never thought it would end like this, Darian said quietly. Olivia nodded. Neither did I, but sometimes we have to accept that the way we fight, the choices we make, will never be fully understood. And in the end, it doesn't matter. We do what we have to do. Darian glanced over at her. Do you think they'll ever truly accept us? She smiled, but it was a sad smile. Maybe, but we don't fight for their approval. We fight because we have to. As they boarded the Valor, the crew stood at attention, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had won. But Darian could see it in their eyes, the same weariness that had overtaken him. They were all survivors, but at what cost? The stars outside the ship's windows stretched and warped as the Valor jumped into faster-than-light travel, leaving the Council's space behind. The galaxy was still the same, but for humanity, everything had changed. Where do we go now? Olivia asked, her voice soft. Darian stared out the viewport, the vastness of the galaxy before them. We go home, but this time we don't forget what we had to do to get here. The comms crackled to life as Darian Voss walked onto the command deck of the Valor. The soft hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks. The battle was over, But the war, as it always had been for humanity, was never truly won. His gaze fell on the holographic map in front of him, a galaxy in motion, divided by power struggles and a cold reminder of what Earth had become, a last resort. "Commander," Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood by the viewport, her eyes tracing the path of the Valor as it glided through the stars. "How long before we're needed again?" Darian didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. They both knew that when the galaxy's rules failed, humanity would be called upon once more. But it wasn't something to celebrate. The idea that Earth would only be asked to fight when every other option had failed, it felt like a strange, hollow victory. "It's done," Darian said quietly, as much to himself as to Olivia. "We're the galaxy's insurance policy, a necessary evil." Olivia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Not just evil," she replied. "Survival. What we do is necessary. There's no shame in that. But there is a cost," Darian said. "A cost we'll never fully pay." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavier than the stars themselves. They had won, yes. But at what cost? Thousands of lives lost. The cost of Earth's brutal methods etched into their history. And now they were the galaxy's final option. The wild card they'd never fully accept, but one they couldn't afford to lose. They'd saved the galaxy, but it had come with the sharp sting of isolation. A place in the galaxy, but not one that anyone truly wanted for Earth. "We've been given a place in the galaxy," Olivia said, breaking the silence. "A place that no one else wants to fill, but it's ours." Darian nodded. "And it's one we can't ignore. The moment Earth is needed again, we'll be there." He glanced over at the laser plasma display at the far end of the room. The fleet had been dispatched, and now the Valor was heading home. It would be months before they'd be back in council space, but Darian knew that the message had been sent. Humanity wasn't gone. They hadn't disappeared into obscurity, but their place had been defined. The door to the command deck opened, and Lieutenant Miller entered, his eyes cautious. "Commander, we've received word from the council," he said, his tone respectful. "The amendment passed. Earth's place in the galaxy is now officially limited." Darian didn't need to ask for more details. He had heard enough. Earth was officially the last resort, called upon only when all else had failed. They were the unspoken warriors, the ones who'd fight when everyone else was too afraid to dirty their hands. He turned away from the display, his gaze meeting Olivia's. "And what does that mean for us?" "It means we fight only when we must," Olivia said. "But it also means we're a force that can't be ignored anymore. We don't fight for glory. We fight for survival." Darian clenched his fists at his sides. There was truth in her words, but it didn't make it any easier. "A force they can't control," he muttered. The news from the council was clear enough. They had accepted humanity's role, but only in the narrowest of circumstances. When the galaxy teetered on the edge of annihilation, when there was no other option, Earth would step in. But until then, the ban on their involvement remained. "We've done what we needed to do," Olivia said. "Now it's time to reflect on what comes next." Darian didn't answer at first. He was too deep in thought. The thought of fighting again, of giving humanity that next chance to prove their worth, was unsettling. But at the same time, there was a part of him that knew it was inevitable. "Do you think they'll ever see us as equals?" Darian asked, his voice quieter this time. Olivia looked at him, her eyes dark with the weight of what they had experienced. "They'll never understand us," she said, "but that doesn't mean they won't need us." And that, in the end, was the hardest part to swallow. The galaxy had learned to live without humanity until it couldn't anymore. And when that time came, Earth would be there, ready, willing to sacrifice once again, despite what it cost them. The Valor glided past the remains of the enemy fleet, the final battle now behind them. But it wasn't just the end of this conflict. It was the beginning of a new understanding, one that could be far more dangerous than anything they had yet faced. Darian watched the stars pass by, a vast expanse of nothing and everything. The future of humanity in the galaxy was uncertain. There would be battles to fight, sacrifices to make, and painful decisions to endure. But they were Earth's burden to bear. As they made their way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than just survivors. They were a force that had been tested, broken, and forged anew in the fires of war. Whether the galaxy was ready for them or not, humanity's place had been set. They would not fade into the shadows. They would stand at the edge, waiting for the call that they knew was inevitable. And when it came, humanity would answer. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. For the galaxy, for survival, for a future that would only exist if humanity was there to protect it. The Valor disappeared into the darkness of deep space, the future ahead uncertain, but the resolve of its crew unwavering. Humanity was the last line of defense, the final resort when the galaxy had nowhere else to turn. And in that bitter truth, Darien found an unspoken resolve. Earth's role had been sealed, and they would play it to the end. The bridge of the Valor was quiet as Captain Jack Reynolds watched the starry void stretch out beyond the viewport. The galaxy, once filled with so many unknowns, now felt like a land where humanity's fate was inescapably tied to the rules they had broken. Despite their victories, despite their pivotal role in securing peace for New Hope, the future was anything but certain. As much as they had become a necessary force, humanity's place was still a contested issue. The galaxy, its vast councils and competing factions, could never forget the price they had paid to get here. "We're no longer just an outpost in space, Jack," Darien Voss said from behind him, his voice tight. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the star maps on the display screen. "But that doesn't mean they trust us." Reynolds knew the truth of Darien's words. Humanity had been dragged into galactic affairs not by diplomacy, but by necessity. And now, as the Council scrambled to pick up the pieces of the war-torn systems, humanity had become a fixture of the galaxy's fragile political ecosystem, though not one the Council embraced openly. "They'll never fully accept us," Olivia Donovan said, entering the bridge. She made no attempt to soften the grimness of her words, her tone steady as always. "But they need us now, and that's the only reason we're not back on Earth, sitting idle." Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What's the price we'll pay for this?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "We fought, and they called us savages. We saved them, and they still look at us like the last thing they want in their systems." Olivia looked at him, her face calm, but her eyes reflecting something darker, an understanding. "The price is simple, Jack," she replied. "They need us to fight, and we'll fight when they can't, but that doesn't mean we'll be accepted." She paused, almost as if weighing her next words carefully. "And you know it's only a matter of time before they come knocking again. When they do, we'll be ready." "But will they ever stop treating us like a weapon?" Darien interjected, his voice sharp. "We aren't just some tool to wield when they need us." Reynolds paused, thinking. "Maybe not," he said after a long silence. "But right now, that's what we are. The universe only calls when it needs you. And for all their talk, the Council still fears our methods." He turned back to the view of the stars, the silence on the bridge nearly oppressive. "And they will call again." The laser plasma display flickered with new data, cutting through the tension. A message from the Council was flashing on the screen, an official communication. "It's Vareth," Olivia murmured. She glanced up at Reynolds, then back at the screen. "He's calling for another session. After everything, they still think they can control us." Reynolds let out a low sigh. "What do they want now?" "More debate." "No," Olivia replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. "This time, it's about action." The Council had been debating humanity's role in future conflicts for days now, and it was clear they had no easy solution. On one hand, Earth's methods had proven effective beyond their wildest expectations, but on the other, the Council's insistence on moral and ethical warfare was being eroded by humanity's willingness to do whatever it took to win. There were factions within the Council that argued for full alliance with Earth's military might, while others, most notably the Ashari and Vith, held on to their pacifistic ideals and feared what humanity might do if left unchecked. "Let's hear it then," Reynolds said. "We've made our place. Now it's time to hear if they'll let us stay." Minutes later, the heads-up display came alive with a holographic projection of Ambassador Vareth. His image was stern, his face a neutral mask, but Reynolds could tell there was a weariness about him. The toll of these debates was apparent. Vareth's people had always been the pacifists, the ones who valued diplomacy above all else. Yet even they couldn't deny the utility of humanity's brutal methods. Captain Reynolds, Vareth began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic tradition. We have heard the calls from your people. Earth's military, though it has been most unorthodox in its methods, has proven invaluable in securing peace where others have failed. Reynolds folded his arms across his chest, unwilling to make the first move. And what's the Council's decision? More speeches? More moralizing? The Ashari ambassador's expression stiffened, but remained composed. The Council has decided to allow humanity's participation in future galactic conflicts, but with strict limitations. Earth will only be permitted to engage in battles that threaten the galaxy's very existence. You will remain on the fringes as a last resort, called upon when no other option exists. Reynolds gritted his teeth but kept his expression neutral. In other words, you'll use us when you've exhausted every other option. That's the price of saving you all, isn't it? Do not mistake necessity for a lack of respect, Vareth countered, his voice losing some of its earlier coldness. The Council is divided. Some see humanity as a necessary force, a final line of defense. Others remain skeptical of your unorthodox tactics, but all agree that you have proven your worth when all other methods have failed. Somehow, I'm not reassured, Darian muttered under his breath. Vareth continued, unaware of the undercurrent of frustration. This decision is not without its complications. We are reluctant to allow your methods to be fully integrated into the broader galactic order, but we acknowledge that there are moments where your flexibility will be essential. Olivia met Reynolds' gaze, her eyes steady. They'll never truly accept us, she said softly, not like they accept their own. And maybe that's how it should be, Darian added. We fight for survival, not approval. Vareth's image flickered, the transmission drawing to a close. Earth will remain a force for good or for chaos, depending on how you choose to wield your power. The future is uncertain, but the galaxy will need you, Captain Reynolds. And when the time comes, the Council will call upon you again. With that, the transmission ended, leaving a silence that filled the bridge like an oppressive weight. Humanity's future was still uncertain, but their role was now set in stone. Earth had become the galaxy's last resort. Reynolds finally broke the silence. We knew this would happen, he said quietly. They'll call us when they have no other choice, and when they do, we'll be ready. Darian stepped forward, his voice heavy. But what happens when we're no longer needed? When they forget what we've done for them? Olivia looked at him, her expression softened by years of shared history. We do what we always do, Darian. We survive, and when they forget, we remind them. The Valor drifted silently in the dark, heading back toward Earth. The galaxy beyond was still filled with its mysteries and challenges, but for now humanity's role had been carved out. And though they would forever be the wild card, the galaxy's unpredictable force, they had earned their place, a place where they would fight only when necessary, and where they would leave their mark, whether the galaxy liked it or not. The Valor drifted into the heart of Council space once more. It was not the homecoming the crew had imagined. No celebratory arrival, no reception from allies. The cold vastness of the space ahead of them felt like a weight pressing down on their shoulders, heavy with the expectation of what was to come. Darian stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the laser plasma displays. The colors from the screen bathed his face, but his mind was far from the technology. He was thinking about the final confrontation with the Galactic Council, thinking about what it would cost humanity this time. Captain, the voice of Olivia Donovan broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her expression resolute but tinged with the same weariness he felt. Are we ready for this? He didn't answer immediately. How could he? Humanity's role in this galaxy was still too uncertain. We'll have to be. There's no other choice now. A voice crackled over the intercom. Incoming transmission from the Council. Darian took a deep breath. This was it, the final stage of the battle for humanity's place in the galaxy. No more second chances. No more calls for help. They had to prove themselves once and for all. The laser plasma display flickered to life, showing the familiar face of Ambassador Vareth. His presence was usually one of calm diplomacy, but today there was something darker in his demeanor. Captain Reynolds, Commander Voss, Captain Donovan. Vareth's voice was stiff, his gaze cold. You have come again, and this time the matter is of utmost importance. The void swarm presses further into our space, and the Council finds itself divided on how to address this threat. Some still question your methods, your brutality, your unpredictability. Others believe that without you, we are lost. Darian exchanged a glance with Olivia. It was a paradox. They had been called upon because no one else could fight the way they did. Yet still, they were feared, not trusted. What is the Council's decision? Darian asked, his voice steady but edged with the urgency he felt. We will convene a final session, Vareth replied. The decision will be made then. Until then, we need you to prepare your forces. Humanity's fate, and the fate of the galaxy, may hinge on what you do next. The screen went dark, and the tension on the bridge thickened like the still air before a storm. For a long moment, no one spoke. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do but wait. The following days were a blur of preparations, briefings, and military posturing. The Valor and the rest of the Earth fleet moved into position, not knowing whether they were preparing for their final stand or another diplomatic failure. The Council had already drawn the line. They were divided, and they knew they couldn't fight alone. Yet they couldn't fully embrace humanity's chaotic approach either. Do they still fear us? Olivia asked, breaking the silence as she stood beside Darian on the observation deck. Darian's gaze was distant, his thoughts clouded. It's not just fear, Olivia. It's something deeper. They don't understand us. They don't see the necessity behind our actions. They think we're reckless. But we're not. We're doing what needs to be done. He nodded slowly, his expression darkening. And they can't accept that. They can't accept that we'll sacrifice anything and everything for survival. We're a threat to their way of life because we don't fight by their rules. Olivia turned to face him, her eyes hardening with a cold resolve. And we'll fight like we always have. We'll do whatever it takes, even if they can't see the reason. A voice interrupted their contemplation. Admiral, the communications officer said, the Council has called for an emergency session. The final vote is about to take place. Darian's stomach tightened. The moment had arrived. This was no longer about war tactics. It was about philosophy, about whether humanity's brutal methods were justified by the galaxy's desperation. We've fought with everything we have, Olivia said as she turned toward the door. Now we see if it was enough. The council chamber was filled with hushed voices, the weight of centuries-old traditions and debates hanging in the air. The representatives of countless species took their seats, their faces reflecting both exhaustion and uncertainty. Vareth stood at the head of the room, his posture stiff with the gravity of the decision at hand. Today, Vareth began, his voice calm but firm, the Council will decide whether to permanently lift the restrictions placed on humanity or whether to keep the ban intact. For all its effectiveness, humanity's methods are not the methods of this Council. There was an uneasy murmur among the representatives. Many had argued that the Void Swarm's relentless advance demanded a change in policy, but there were still voices of dissent, voices who believed that humanity's unorthodox approach was too dangerous to be allowed full reign. Darian, Olivia, and the Earth delegation stood together, waiting for their fate to be decided. The pressure was unbearable. He felt his mind racing, but for once, his words failed him. I call for a vote, Vareth continued. Shall humanity be permitted to engage in galactic conflicts only when an existential threat to civilian populations exists? The voting panel lit up, signaling that the decision was now in the hands of the Council. Each representative's vote was weighed carefully, but it was clear that this was no longer about laws or alliances. It was about survival. The results were displayed on the screen, and a collective gasp rose from the room. By a narrow margin, Vareth said, the proposal has passed. Darian could feel the weight of history shifting as the room fell into stunned silence. The galaxy had just made a choice. Humanity would not be fully integrated into the galactic order, but it would be allowed to act as a necessary evil, a protector when no one else could be. Olivia stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. We did it, she whispered, but Darian was already thinking ahead. We've won, but at what cost? As the meeting ended, Darian and Olivia stood alone in the quiet of the chamber, the magnitude of the decision sinking in. They were no longer exiles, but they were far from equals. The council had acknowledged their strength, but humanity's place in the galaxy remained uncertain, and always would. "What now?" Olivia asked, breaking the silence. Darian stared out at the stars beyond the chamber, a new resolve settling over him. "We continue. We fight when we must, and we protect those who can't protect themselves. No one else can do it the way we can. And if they forget," he smiled grimly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured, "we remind them, every time they need us." And as the Earth fleet prepared to depart the council chambers, the vast expanse of space stretched out before them, a reminder that the galaxy would always need the humanity they feared, even if they never fully understood it.